In this video, I'll show you my photos along with my settings, and I'll go over some of my thought process in the field while photographing the muskox at Dovre. If you haven't seen the whole adventure from Dovre 2023, you can check out that video first here.
Or to be honest, just spotted two of them straight ahead, just below us.
It wasn't until the very end of day one, with only a little bit of light left, that we finally got close to two muskox. Once we saw the two animals, I immediately got my OM-1 with the 150-400 lens attached. This was the first time I got to use the lens. I started taking photos from far away using the zoom, but from this distance and angle, it made more sense to go wider, and I decided to include the tree-covered hill behind the muskox. I really like to include the environment in my images. So while we were still quite far away, I also got out my other camera, which had the 4150-2.8 on it, and included even more of the landscape. Even though we didn't have much time before the sun would set, we still had to move slowly so as not to scare the muskox. We walked in a wide arch to get into position so that the colourful sky would be behind the animals as we got a little bit closer. When the muskox were sitting, I could use a slow shutter speed to keep my ISO as low as possible. With my 300 that I've used for years, I would have gone even lower, but since the longer reach of up to 500mm was new to me, I kept it around 100th of a second and sometimes down to a 50th of a second. Now when the animal started to move about to feed, I had to increase both the shutter and ISO to freeze the movement. So I get a lot of questions about which exposure mode do I use and how do I expose in the snow. Well, when it comes to exposure mode, to be honest, I don't actually know what it's in. I think it's in the default, which is something like evaluative metering. The thing is that with a mirrorless camera, I find it really easy to expose correctly. I expose to the right, I use highlight alerts, so I instantly get feedback to know when I'm overexposing my highlights. I'll show you here at the back of my camera. We'll see here that it's bright, and you see that it shows red. If I make it brighter, it shows even more red. That all the red there, that's highlight alerts, that's telling me this area is overexposed. Basically, when I see red, I want to make the image a little bit darker. I back it off, make it a bit darker until I don't see it, and then I get a correct exposure, and I expose all the way to the right. So I retain as much detail as I possibly can in the image. Now I shoot in full manual, so I adjust this by either lowering my ISO to get the lowest ISO possible, or increasing my shutter speed if I need a faster shutter speed to freeze the action. If you shoot in a semi-automatic mode like aperture priority or shutter speed priority, you can use the exposure compensation dial and do the exact same thing. And it is super easy with a camera like this. If you're interested, I have a course on the OM system for wildlife photography, which cover all sorts of settings like this, how I configure my camera and how I use the OM system in the field for wildlife photography. I'll put a link to it here and you can check it out if you would like to. So just a quick bit on post-processing here. I've exposed this image here. This is one of the images that I show in the video, and I've exposed all the way to the right, just as I talk about here. You can see it in the histogram, and that means that the sky is just really bright looking, but all the detail is there. This is actually pink and orange. Because the muskox, the very dark, hairy animal, it just absorbs all the light. That's why I think it's really important for it to even expose more to the right so that I can retain more information and detail on the muskox, and then I can selectively darken the rest of the image afterwards to kind of bring the colors back into the image. First step was bring it into DxO Pure Raw, and I did a trial of the DxO Pure Raw 2, and I found that it actually did quite a bit better job than another program that I have been using. I actually contacted DxO and they've kindly given me their products, so I got an advanced copy of Pure Raw 3, and I think it does an amazing job. So that is my kind of first step when I'm editing an image these days. If you haven't tried it, sign up for 30 days for a free trial and just compare images, see what you think. After that, I do my post-processing. I'm not going to go through the entire steps right here, but this is the final image. And if I flick back and forth, you can kind of see the exposure on the muskox staying kind of the same because it's so dark anyways. I'm just selectively darkening the rest of the image and getting those kind of bluey tones of the twilight back into the snow, and just over a feel of what it was like when I was there. So the only thing I'm trying to be careful here is not to make the muskox look kind of fake. You know, if the muskox is super bright and the rest of the image is very dark, there's got to be a natural balance there, which hopefully I managed to achieve. When the scenery looks this stunning, I couldn't help but try for some different compositions and go for some landscape images. I think we all ended up with an image of that tree. Now you can see in this image that I took it at 150mm to include the environment, and I had to use an ISO of 4000. Now, had I had time, I would have swapped to my 4150 and used an f-stop of f2.8 to lower my ISO. But the muskox would only lift its head very occasionally, so I just had to go for the gear I had in hand. Day 2, morning. We tended to have an easy morning at the cabin, but when I saw the light in the sky, I just had to grab my camera and lens and go for a little wander. I photographed some of the distant peaks and whatever else took my fancy. Probably the only other animal I photographed on this trip was a bullfinch outside the cabin early in the morning. I thought I'd include it here as it was taken handheld at a 50th of a second at 500mm with an ISO of 5000. So the colours are absolutely stunning at this time in the morning before the sun has even come up. There's a lot of detail on the bullfinch still at ISO 5000. Now this is because I exposed to the right and I used the noise reduction software Pure Raw 3. Day 3, Högsnytta. At Högsnytta, we stayed in one place, and the images were dictated by the movement of the muskox. We waited for hours while the muskox were resting, but every now and then we'd have some movement which made it much more interesting for photography. There were 8 animals walking along the ridge high above us, and I found myself completely mesmerized by this herd of muskox. I took a couple of images taking advantage of the extensive zoom of the 150-400, especially when they were running. However, I mostly zoomed out to a wider angle for these muskox to show the spectacular scenery and cliffs below them. This year I've decided to put a lot more time into learning, and it was while watching David Yarrow's Masters of Photography class that I was inspired to turn some of my images into black and white. It was also while watching David's series on photographing the bison that I decided to photograph the muskox with a higher f-stop to get more detail in the fur. I can highly recommend both David Yarrow's and Paul Nicklin's courses on Masters of Photography. Lots of knowledge and such inspiring stories. It got very cold when the wind picked up at the end of the day, but I don't think any of us minded as the photography just got better and better. Getting the motion in the fur of the muskox was something I really wanted to capture, so I was ecstatic when one of the males got up and started to walk in our direction with the wind coming in from the side. I took full advantage of the zoom here. I also tried the 1.4 teleconverter, which gave me an incredible 700mm reach while using the built-in 1.25. When there was a lot of light, I used a higher f-stop, both to get more of the animal and fur sharp, but also to get the eyes sharp of several animals in the same frame. Most of the time, the muskox were not doing much, and we would sit and wait for something to happen. Later in the day, when the light got good, I used these quiet times to take some landscape images of this stunning scenery. I was using the OM-5 with the M.Zuiko 150-400mm f2.8 to vlog with, so it was very handy to get a few frames with this setup without needing to swap lenses. As the sun set, the colours were incredible. At this point, the muskox were lying down with their backs to the wind, and I took my last image of the trip. I do check out my blog post as well to see all the photos and settings and all the gear that I use for a trip like this.